All right, hello again, everybody. Welcome back to Airbus320 Tech Talk. Thanks again for joining me. I'm out on an overnight right now in Philadelphia, and today's video is going to be just kind of a little bit different than, or an offshoot rather, of all the videos I'm making, kind of doing the cockpit button tour sequentially, stepping through all the panels in the Airbus. I'd mentioned some time ago that I was going to start doing like a Q&A type of thing for you guys, so I've had a few comments and questions start to come in, and there's certainly things that warrant a little extra time in discussing. So I wanted to just kind of make some standalone videos to kind of address those things as they come in. So the first one, I had a question from a user last week. Once again, Juha V. Thanks again for writing in, and wherever you are in the world, I appreciate you watching, of course. And Juha's question specifically, he just wanted to know about the takeoff and the landing in the Airbus. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. I'm going to kind of structure this. I'm going to first go through just kind of the basic profile that we kind of fly through, and we'll talk a little about the call-outs and kind of what happens at each stage in the takeoff. And then I'm going to kind of come back, and there's a couple interesting things at various points in the takeoff procedure that I wanted to kind of tell you guys about. So today, like I said, we're going to focus on the takeoff. We'll make another video. We'll talk about the landing that he wanted to know about. But first of all, I'd mentioned in the last video that I made that every takeoff in a transport category airplane is pretty much like a cookie cutter standardized procedure. I mean, we do it the same way. The exact like I said, the same way pretty much every time that we do this, and there are some slight exceptions. We'll talk about that towards the end of the video. But like I said, everything that I'm going to kind of tell you in the first portion here is kind of our standard thing that it happens. Call it 95% of the time that we're taking off. Most days we're in a quote unquote normal type of situation with normal performance and all this kind of stuff. So a lot of this applies. There's also an infinite level of detail that we could go into today. We start talking about some of the call-outs that I'm going to walk you through, and the FMA indications that you would see if you're in the flight deck flying through one of these things. So once again, we could dig so deep on this, and we'll try to come back at a certain point in time and address each of those things in more detail if you have questions, and maybe later on down the line as we continue our discussion about the technical aspects of the airplane there. But so let's get started. First of all, I made a really crude graphic of kind of what the standard takeoff profile looks like. So this is kind of like a side view, if you will, and it kind of steps through, like I said, some of the major things that happen and occur at various points in the procedure here. So let's just assume that we're just taking the runway. And let's say that I'm the first officer, I'm pilot flying, and the captain is the monitoring pilot in this case. So we'll just kind of walk through what happens, like I said, at each step in the game. So first thing, of course, the captain taxis the airplane out onto the runway. He lines it up on the center line, and he's going to say something like, "You have control," and I will respond and say, "I have control." The next thing we're going to do is we're going to look down at the heading indicator, and we're going to basically verify and check that the runway heading, or the actual direction the nose is pointed in, verifies or checks out with the intended runway that we're taking off on. And the reason why we do this is there have been instances in the past. One of the saddest accidents in the last 10 years, I think, Comair 5191, the crew accidentally took off on a kind of like a crossing runway from the one they had intended to take off on, and this was, of course, a shorter runway that was necessary to safely get the airplane off the ground. Really sad. They crashed. I think 49 people out of the 50 on board had perished in that one. So it's things like that. Has happened before in aviation. That's why we're pretty much religious about verifying the runway heading when we roll out there, so we make sure we're taking off on the right runway. So once again, I'm pilot flying. I'm going to say, runway heading 014. Monitoring pilot's going to say checked, and that's our verification that we both agree. So we'll wait, of course, for the tower to assign us the takeoff instruction. When we get that, I would bring the thrust levers up first to the 50% N1 mark, and we're going to kind of wait for the engines to spool up and accelerate. Once they're both kind of putting out an equal amount of thrust, or at equal speeds rather, we'll slowly start to bring the thrust levers to detents. First past the climb detent and then up into the MCT, or max continuous thrust, or flex detent, which is the second one on the Airbus. And at that point, it's going to trigger a bunch of FMAs to pop up, kind of on the PFD. So I'm going to say something like man flex, SRS, runway, auto thrust blue. And monitoring pilot's just going to say checked. Those are all normal indications in this instance. So we're rolling down the runway, and we get to this the point where we roll through 80 knots. So monitoring pilot's going to say 80 knots, and pilot flying is going to say checked. We continue to accelerate, and the monitoring pilot once again is going to call out V1 and rotate, and that's of course our cue to start pitching the airplane up and letting us know it's ready to fly. So a nice smooth rotation, 3 degrees per second is pretty standard in a transport airplane. So we slowly rotate, we break ground, and we're going to, at this point, have some the command bars kind of up on our PFD, of course, just kind of directing us, on the initial stage of the climb there. So we pitched the airplane right up into the command bars, and we're going to fly up at that attitude and speed, V2 plus 10, pretty typically, or that's kind of the standard what it is in the Airbus, and most airplanes for that matter. We're going to fly that up till we get to 1,000 feet above the field elevation. And at that point is our standard thrust reduction and acceleration altitude. So the command bars are going to direct all this to happen, but it's going to direct us to bring the thrust levers back into the climb detent. So we'll nice and smoothly move them out of the flex MCT detent there and bring them back into the climb detent. And the FMA is going to depict that as well. And also we're going to start to pitch down and start to accelerate the airplane to the slat retract speed, whatever it is. So we are going to let the airplane pick up speed. When we get to the little cue, there's a little bug on the speed tape on the Airbus that kind of tells you when to do this. And so flying pilot will call out flaps 0 after takeoff checklists. And this is assuming we did a flaps 1 plus F takeoff, which once again is pretty standard for a lot of days that we operate, given conditions. So the monitoring pilot is going to look down and say speed checked, flap 0 after takeoff checklist. And at that point, we're picking up speed, and normally we're a normal climb out, in the United States here below 10,000 feet, 250 knots is kind of the speed limit and the standard that we're going to use most of the time. So we'll just like I said, we'll accelerate to that point, and we'll keep our climb going up till 10,000 feet, where we're going to accelerate again to the kind of the cruise climb portion, where we'll take ourselves all the way up to altitude at a given speed that the box is telling us to do. So once again, just to back up, after you call the after takeoff checklist, this is kind of a silent read and verify one for the pilot monitoring. So after he just kind of checks, the Airbus, there's 4 items on it. So it's landing gear is up, flaps and slats are retracted, the speed brakes get disarmed, and we're just going to check to see that we're pressurizing. So after he's verified all that stuff, he's going to say after takeoff checklist complete, and we are off to the races after that with our flight. So that kind of spells out all the basics about what happens on a normal takeoff. And like I said, I wanted to kind of back up and talk in detail about a couple of the different things I think a lot of people are curious about why they're feeling and sensing certain things during the takeoff. So the first one that I had some notes on, I wanted to talk to you guys about this business about early on in the procedure when I talked about bringing the thrust levers up to the 50% mark and letting the engines spool up. So first of all, what is this all about? Why do we do that? Well, first of all, this term spooling up, what exactly does that mean? Well, you consider a modern high bypass turbofan engine. You have this core of the engine that kind of spins around and does what it does, but then there's this basically there's air blowing over this free turbine that's shafted forward to the fan section or the N1 section, or in other words, this is just the first the big blades that you see in the front of the engine, and this fan section is actually the one that's responsible for the majority of thrust output that the engine gives us. So there's excuse me, there's essentially a lag time from like when the the core of the engine comes up to speed and starts directing, the air in the way that it does, like we said, there's a lag that it takes to accelerate the N1 section up to the appropriate velocity that it needs, or that it should be at to generate our thrust that we need for takeoff. And kind of way you can think about this is like, let's say you had a garden hose and you had a big water wheel in your backyard, and you went out and you turned the garden hose up to full blast, and you pointed it kind of at the water wheel with the intent of accelerating that water wheel. Well, the water wheel is not just going to immediately, instantaneously jump up to high speed. It's going to take some time to build its momentum and kind of, get up to match the rotation speed that, maybe, in this case, I'm using the garden hose to kind of equate to the N2 section or the core section of the engine. But so there is this lag time in there, and because of that, all the engines on the airplanes, they're actually, at different stages in their life. So they actually kind of, they will each perform, slightly different. So maybe one spools up a little bit faster than the other does. I mean, they don't always spool up at the exact same rate. And once again, the whole reason why we do this is because, let's say we were to bring the thrust levers immediately up to the takeoff position there, and one of the engines spools up, way faster than the other, or maybe one of the engines doesn't spool up at all for whatever reason. It's probably a rare thing to happen, but I suppose it is possible. You could be in a situation where you're just getting a massive amount of thrust out, one side of the aircraft there, and supposedly it's enough that you could spin the airplane around, or probably more likely take it off the side of the runway if you weren't immediately taking corrective action or stepping on the brakes or bringing the thrust levers back. But it's kind of the reason, like I said, why we do this. We want to kind of give the engines a chance to, like we said, get up to speed. And of course, if you go back and look at jet engine performance, I mean, they actually make a majority of the thrust like between the 50 and 100% range of speeds there when we talk about these things. So that is the reason why we do that. And kind of an interesting little sidebar, you're starting to hear more and more about these geared turbofan engines where there is actually a gearing system and a gearbox that it kind of takes out of the equation this business about the water wheel and the acceleration time lag there. But that's a whole other kind of future technology. And most of the engines still out there on our transport airplanes these days are still kind of the high bypass turbofan with the setup that I'm talking about there. So once again, when you're in the back, I mean, I've had people ask me this before. Like you roll out on the runway, you kind of feel them like hey, why do they only bring the engines up like halfway, and there's like this little pause in between there, and then they go all the way up to full thrust. I mean, that is the reason. So hopefully that makes sense for you guys. The next one that I want to talk about is the 80 knot call out. You might be wondering, why do we do that? Why is it necessary? Why is it there? That one, a couple different reasons. The biggest reason that the book talks about is that you just need to verify that the takeoff thrust is actually set and acquired prior to reaching 80 knots, because of course we don't have the engines operating as we need them or expect them to do. We don't have the takeoff performance necessarily guaranteed that we need to get the airplane up and safely away from the ground. And so it's just basically a check for the monitoring pilot to look down and just make sure that once again the N1 speeds are up into the target there where they should be. If they're not, you're going to reject the takeoff. There's obviously something wrong. So there's the verification of engine performance, of course, but it's also a good time to kind of check the capacity of the flying pilot. Maybe something happened, and a rare circumstance, of course, but it's kind of a check just to make sure that hey, I'm still here, coherent, paying attention, and I am, as the pilot, I'm functioning as well. And then of course one thing that we check at the same time too is that we both have two good airspeed indications that agree with one another, and things are proceeding normally with our takeoff. So. The other one that I want to tell you about is the V1 callout. There's a bug on the speed tape, of course, that tells us when we get to this velocity, but you're actually going to make the V1 callout 5 knots prior to when the speed target rolls through the bug on the tape there. And the reason for that is because there's an assumed lag of human reaction time that, if you were in some circumstance where you did have a failure prior to V1 and you need to reject the takeoff, the manufacturer is kind of assuming that, like we said, there's going to be this little lag in time that it takes you to react to a situation like that. So the 5 knots prior just kind of accounts for this principle, and theoretically allows, from a performance standpoint, that you are physically starting the reject of the takeoff literally before V1, because if you're after it, technically you're supposed to be going, and you don't necessarily always have the performance, once again, to stop the airplane safely, and it's better to take it airborne and deal with the issue there. So that's kind of why we do that, kind of an interesting thing. The other thing that I want to talk about is the rotation in a transport category airplane. Like we said before, 3 degrees per second is a very standard rate of rotation. That's just kind of like a nice, gentle, easy raising of the nose. And tail strike awareness is such a big deal on these airplanes, and especially as we start talking about longer planes with longer fuselages, it's even more of a big deal. So for example, on our fleet, we operate the 319, 320, and 321. The 321, it's a big deal, this business about striking the tail. So you just need to be really careful when you do start that rotation. You're just making it very slowly, very gentle. Supposedly the 7 degrees is the max pitch that we want to use while the wheels are still on the ground to give us a safe margin of clearance between the tail and the ground before it gets up and airborne. So that's the 321 number, and then the 319 number and 320 number is 10 degrees. So we're really watching those things when we're taking off. So once again, when you're sitting in the back, a lot of times, like, you're going to feel the sensation of this, like, nice, gentle, easy, kind of slow raising of the nose. And then once the airplane breaks ground, you probably feel this, like, aggressive, more like pitch up. And, the pilots what they're doing is they're pitching into that V2 plus 10 target that we need for the initial segment or stage of the climb there to meet our performance gradient to get away from the ground safely. So once again, what's happening there is, like, because of that slow rotation, you're actually still continuing to pick up some airspeed. So you might end up, by the time the airplane breaks the ground, that you're more than 10 knots above V2, and there's just correction that needs to be made in there. Of course, that comes in the form of pitch, and so that's why, once again, you feel this, maybe a little bit more aggressive pitch up when the airplane finally does get off the ground. So that is what that is all about. And I kind of mentioned it in the beginning of the video, but there are, of course, times when we don't adhere completely to this, skeleton takeoff profile that I just described to you. And some of those instances might be, I'll tell you just a couple, in the real world here that I've seen and dealt with. And of course, this is, I fly pretty much in Northern America here. But I'm sure you guys, if you're watching around the world anywhere, you certainly have airports that have terrain around them, or they have strange airspace around them, which necessitates different types of climbs, or any number of things I suppose could affect this. Noise abatement is the other big one that kind of drives this here. But as an example, so let's take a look at one of the ones that I see a lot. Leaving San Francisco, we have this truck and 2 departure. The first fix, if you're taking off on the ones here, is you have to make tie-dye at or above 3,000 feet, and that's for Oakland's airspace on the other side of the bay. Most of the time, this isn't a problem. If you're on a close to standard temperature day with an average loading, so to speak, the airplane has no problem making that sort of climb gradient. But there are instances where, hey, if it's a really hot day and, aircraft performance is going to suffer, or maybe we're completely loaded, we're going to the East Coast or something like that, we're at max weight, sometimes it might be a struggle. And the Airbus is actually really neat. It has the ability to kind of project, even on the ground, or as you start getting going, whether or not you're going to make a climb restriction or not. So it can kind of give you this forewarning and say, hey, you're going to need to do something kind of above and beyond what you're normal or what you're programmed for here to do in order for me to get up and get above 3,000 feet at tie-dye in this case here. So One of the things we can do is we can actually alter the thrust reduction or the acceleration altitude, so we can continue the climb at our V2 plus 10 speed up to a higher altitude, where at that point we can put the nose down and start to accelerate. And this of course is going to give us the best climb angle, so to speak, to get us up above this restriction in this case. So I took a picture the other night of the area on the MCDU where you can actually alter this. It's pretty neat, but this is on the it's the perf page on the takeoff runway page here. There's still some data that's yet to be filled in, but what we're looking at right here is this thrust reduction and acceleration altitude here. So normally it's just defaulted to be 1,000 feet above field elevation. So in this case here it's 1010 for the runway in San Francisco, one right. But you can come in here and make a user input to change this to pretty much whatever you want it to be. So a lot of times, like the technique that guys will use is they'll change both these numbers to 3,000, for example, so that just ensures that the airplane's not going to direct you to pitch down and accelerate before you get to 3,000 feet. So it just kind of makes it easy if you want to kind of see the box kind of projecting and directing things. In order to meet this restriction in this case here. One neat thing though is that even if you forgot to put this data in here, of course, like all of us as our normal piloting stuff that we do, I mean, you can kind of tell if you're going to be tight on a restriction. If you are, you just, even though the airplane's telling you to come back to climb thrust, I mean, you might look at the situation and say, okay, well, I'm just gonna I'm gonna keep my climb attitude for a little bit, and I am going to keep the thrust in a little bit longer. I'm going to make sure we get up and get the airplane climbing as need be. So that's just kind of one different way that this takeoff profile might shake out. So one small example there with the trucking departure out of San Francisco. The other one that's a really kind of a I don't know, I'll call it more extreme, but or a little more aggressive of a procedure where this normal takeoff profile is altered is leaving John Wayne Airport in Orange County. If any of you guys out there have ever flown out of there, I mean, they have this really kind of aggressive noise abatement procedure where you pretty much you get off the ground as quickly as you can, essentially, and at 800 feet, they want you to bring the engine thrust back about 15 or 20% or so. To keep it quiet for all the residents that live around the airport there. And you actually kind of make this little shallow left turn off a little bit, and you kind of coast out in this like quieter, engine thrust output type of profile till you get over the coastline, and then you can kind of pick up the speed and do your normal stuff there. But there is another example where the norm is kind of altered. So just last one to talk about there. And I pulled up one more slide that I wanted to show you guys, and this is once again just kind of straight out of the FCOM here. But it just kind of this is kind of a busy graphic here. You can pause the video later and digest this a little bit more. But basically the reason why I pulled this up is because with every takeoff that we do, really kind of the essence and the reasons why we conduct it in such a manner is because it's all about we want to get the airplane away from the ground as quickly as we can and preserve kind of a safe margin for whatever obstacles or terrain or whatever it is that it might be around the runway. And it's all kind of predicated off this assumption that if we had an engine failure, kind of at the critical point, or maybe just past V1, we just need to make sure that we can clear everything. Otherwise, we wouldn't even attempt a takeoff if we didn't have the performance to do it. So, like I said, this kind of graphic just kind of shows you a little bit more of a breakdown about speeds and segments and distances and things that we need to have from terrain off the end of the runway. But like we said, kind of assuming the worst case scenario, an engine failure, right after takeoff, and just making sure that we can fly the airplane away safely and avoid those things. So. That's pretty much all I had for you guys today. We'll make another video and I'll try to kind of do the same thing, talking about the landings. So appreciate you guys tuning in once again. If you have questions, leave them down in the comment section, and we'll tackle them as they come in. So hope you guys are having a great day out there today, and we'll talk to you soon. Okay, bye.